For real? All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next discussion on analyzing a story. And this time, my nemesis and I are going to be discussing. Yes, you're the nemesis, not me. Not me.
No,
Everyone knows that.
you are the. How can you try and fool people like this? I'm the main character. I'm the protagonist. You are my nemesis.
This is
Or
the all part of his nefarious plot, people. Don't listen.
is this an aspect of subjective perception? Would that tie into where the narrative perspective is lying?
Whose story is this? Is it my story or your story? Who's the narrator here? Yes, people, we are talking about narrators today, and we are hopefully going to mention a few things that will be useful to you in terms of your appreciation, understanding of story. That's what this series is all about. We are talking about aspects of storytelling that we feel have enhanced our love for the story. And today is all about narrators and narrative.
Narrative, not story.
Yes, narrative, not story. Narrative perspective is what we're talking about. So what kind of narrator do we have? Why does it matter? Why does it matter of what kind of narrator you have? How does that affect the story, how the story emerges, what you take from the story, and so many things. So let us begin, dear Nemesis, with distinguishing between the various types of narrative perspectives when we're talking about person. So you can have a first-person narrator, and the clue there is when the narrator uses I or we. The pronouns I and we come up usually when it's a first-person narrator. You have a second-person narrator, which is pretty rare, but does happen. So we do need to talk about that. And then you have the third person. And later we're going to talk about little distinctions within each one. We're going to talk about past tense versus present tense narrative style, and also unreliability. So we're going to have some interesting things to say, I think. But let's start with first person.
Well,
Or,
actually, can
yeah,
we put a
backtrack.
pin in that just for a second? Let's start with narrator.
Oh, that's actually a very good idea, as opposed to author, because this is something that you often do see confused, narrator versus author. So what do you want to say about that, AP?
So one of the ways that we approach this is you have the author, the historical person who was writing at that time and created the thing.
Right.
But if that book was written 5 years ago, that physical person is now 5 years older. And so they are no longer the same person that wrote that story. Yes, they are part of the continuity of that person. But what they think now, the experiences they've had, how they think and feel, those things can be radically different. So we start with historical person, that is author.
Mm.
Then we talk about the implied author. So we look at the text and we go, who was the kind of person that created the whole text?
Right.
That is where we localize an image of the author at that time in which they created it. So author is the physical person in continuity. So, for example, Stephen Erickson is alive today. He is the author of the Malazan Book of the Fallen, but he's not the implied author. The implied author would be the Stephen Erickson back when he was writing, and he's not necessarily that same person. He may share a lot of the same beliefs, but he is a different person. So the implied narrator, or sorry, the implied author,
Mm-hmm.
is different to the actual author.
Yeah.
And one of the ways that we typically keep this in mind is when we refer to like the author, but we talk about Erickson, and we just use the surname Shakespeare because it's not William. We don't know them. We don't know what they were thinking and feeling at
I
the
call
time.
him Willie.
Bill to his friends. But part of that allows us to create that distance between the actual person who is a real life person with real life feelings and
Right.
real life beliefs and the construct of author that we are making, extrapolating from what we have found in the text.
Right.
That implied author has chosen and created a narrator and a narrative perspective. And one of the difficulties with this is if you think of the evolution of the study of literature, the evolution of all of these things. We start with a storyteller, someone who is actually telling a story. They are narrating the
A
narrative.
bard or something. Yeah.
A bard, a skald, was it a scop?
Shop. Yeah.
I was close the first time.
You had it the first time. Yeah.
Um, that they are the narrator. They are narrating to an audience. We see it in a lot of the older classical plays where there is a narrator on stage who is relaying information.
And that's a
And
persona that the bard bestows that they wear while doing that tale, right?
yeah, and so we can see that narrator is different to implied author.
Right.
They're not the same.
Right.
But because of that sort of establishment, we talk a lot about the narrator as if it is a person. But what we're really talking about is a narrative perspective, the perspective from which the narrative is being narrated.
Right.
And we just typically use narrator as a way to discuss it.
And this is
That's
important. This is really important because oftentimes an author will have a narrator who is, say, morally repugnant, perhaps a narrator who is racist or something like that. Now, that does not mean that the author is racist, right? We don't want to confuse these things. That maybe the author is actually trying to make a point about racism by having a racist narrator. Which it might not be fun to read, but this is something that literature does wrestle with. So it's important to distinguish between author and narrator, broadly speaking, as well, isn't it?
and a classic example of that, Lolita by Nabokov. That
Yes. Yeah.
we don't think that he was going, oh yeah, this is silly. I really want to discuss this because this is what gets me off. Like that's
Unfortunately, a
not.
lot of people do confuse that, though. Yeah, in this case, right?
But that's why we make the distinction not only between the historical person who is
Right.
the actual author, the implied author of the text, and the narrator or narrative perspective that they have constructed.
Right.
It's a nice way to divide up these things.
Yep. And yeah, I think that's a very important distinction to keep in mind as you're analyzing. And sometimes an author has an unreliable narrator, which we'll talk about later. But so now, first person. What is first person or a participant narrator? Meaning the narrator is an entity belonging in the story, is part of the story. It could be a major character or even the protagonist, the main character of the story, could be a minor character. Why does it matter? Well, let's you take a story where you have the main character, the protagonist who is telling the story, The Name of the Wind, for example, or Mark Lawrence's Broken Empire trilogy, or his Red Queen's War trilogy. In each of these, you have the main character or protagonist is the narrator. What are the advantages of having this? What can an author achieve by having the protagonist, or another really famous one, obviously Robin Hobb's, the Farseer trilogy and Tawny Man trilogy, and even the final trilogy, Fitz and the Fool. These are first-person narrations. So what are the advantages, AP, of having a first-person narrator?
One of the major advantages of first person is immediacy and intimacy
Mm,
because it places the narrative, the reader, behind the eyes of the character. So as the character experiences things, so do we experience them. There's a closeness of that psychic distance. There's a closeness of that link, which creates immediacy and intimacy. That it's a way to bring us closer into the text and potentially make it more immersive.
mm.
That would be one of the major aspects. Another aspect of it. Oh, it just popped out. Hang on a sec. Give me a second.
And
You carry on with what you're saying. There was
sure.
something I wanted to say there, and I've just temporarily forgotten.
No, that's a great advantage, what you mentioned, the immediacy and all of that. And of course, a disadvantage is that you only have that particular character's perspective, which can lead to a perceived lack of development, maybe among some of the other characters in the story. So that's a sacrifice in a sense. You get a deeper connection to that protagonist, by having that first person narration, if the protagonist is the narrator. Yeah, and we can talk about a more minor character, like I don't know, The Great Gatsby, for example. Gatsby is the protagonist of that story, but the narrator is Nick. He's a fairly important character, but he's not the protagonist of the story. And the reason F. Scott Fitzgerald chose Nick and not Gatsby is you preserve a certain amount of mystery about Gatsby by having Nick be this, and also the reader probably imbibes some of that worshipful, feeling that Nick has about Gatsby. So it was a good choice. Obviously, it'd be a very different story if Gatsby were telling it, right? Or if we
Mhm.
had a different kind of narrator or another character from the story. So the disadvantage there is you sacrifice knowing some of the inner thoughts, the feelings of the other characters in the story. Yes?
Yeah. So this is actually what I was thinking about that it popped out of me. The limitation of information,
Yeah.
um, which it has two effects. One, it generates mystery because we are limited in that perspective
Right.
to what that character can see and know.
Right.
We'll get into omniscience in a minute.
Right.
But one of the reasons why that might be desirable is it actually creates a sense of authenticity
Mm,
because it mimics our perception of the world. It is limited to what we are seeing, what we are perceiving, what we
right.
hear, smell, taste, touch, like all of those things. It creates that sense of authenticity because it is limiting the information to the perception of one individual. And we are so close to that perception that it is a literary example or a literary iteration of what we experience.
Right.
So you can see the draw and the attraction of that. The short timers, who the author of the short timers, I always forget their name.
Oh,
Um, but it's the novella that Full Metal Jacket is based on,
okay.
and it's written in first person and it is written in present tense. Yeah, first person present tense. But there's a lot of immediacy to it. But what happens with a lot of these things is, as you were talking about, if someone is the main character, the protagonist, or if they are a secondary character, are they witness to events and therefore that's how we are experiencing it, or are they the ones perpetrating the events and propelling the narrative? And you
Right.
can see how that is a really significant distinction,
Yeah.
because do you want the story from King Arthur's perspective, do you want it from Merlin's perspective, or do you want it from Gawain's perspective?
Mm,
Because the same events can happen, but depending on where you have placed your literary camera, where you have placed this recording equipment, this sensory equipment that's going to record everything that happens, that is going to shape how they perceive it.
right.
And that can be very, very powerfully manipulated by authors. So, although it is very easy, oh, this is first person, great. Why is it first person? What does it add? What does it take away? What are the strengths and the weaknesses of it? How does it affect how we interact with the narrative, with the
Right.
text?
Right.
Those are all big questions.
So if The Name of the Wind had been narrated by Bass instead of Kvothe, right? I mean, that would be a very different perspective. We would learn different things about the characters, and these decisions matter. Gustav Hasford, is that the person you were trying to think of? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I looked it up.
Yeah, it's an excellent novella.
Okay.
One of the few written in first person present that I really enjoy.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about present versus past in a bit too, and unreliability. Anything else you want to say about first person narration?
Um, First person narration quite often is used. We'll probably get into a discussion of this later on about focalization. And
Yeah.
but even with first person narration, there are different ways of doing it, different levels of what we could kind of label objectivity. Is it limited to what they are perceiving, the physical external stimuli, or are we getting insight into their mind?
Right.
Because while it's both first person, one has access to the mind and the memories and what, those sorts of things. The other is treating them almost like recording equipment for the events, and
Right.
we're not getting their experience. And you can see how those are two different things. Even though they're both first person,
Right.
they're narrating in different ways. And so, like as I had said, it's great to be able to go, it is first person. There's the nice handy thing, the tag that you can put on it. But understanding the type of first person, what is being achieved by it, actually helps you understand the narrative more.
Right, right. The Black Company by Glenn Cook is an interesting. It's Croker who's narrating the at least the initial trilogy.
Yeah.
That's all I've read. I think that's an interesting one. And right,
And there's an interesting distinction that we can make between a homodiegetic narrator and a
right,
heterodiegetic narrator. So homodiegetic, as you would guess with the prefix homo, part of
right,
the diegesis. They are a character and actor within the diegesis.
right.
Heterodiegetic, they are different to, they are external to the diegesis.
Right.
So, in a previous discussion we had, I had said, imagine a scene where the two of us are cooking dinner, and I start narrating a story about a dragon. I, in that moment, would become a heterodiegetic narrator because the
Mm-hmm.
story doesn't involve me. But if I narrated a story about the time I met a dragon, I would be a homodiegetic narrator. And that adds a level of complication and interest to it because
Yeah.
am I going to tell you the unvarnished truth about the interaction? Is it going to be colored by my perception of the interaction? Or am I going to lie to you about the interaction? And all of that goes towards elements of reliability and the unreliable narrator and the
Yep.
untrustworthy narrator, which we'll get into.
We're getting into
But
that. Yeah.
so again, knowing the terms is not the big deal, but it's understanding that sometimes you can have a first person narrator who is heterodiegetic if
Mm,
they are telling you the story about someone else and they don't figure in it. You go, when does that happen? And you go, 1001 Arabian Nights.
sure.
Charizard tells these stories that she is not part of.
You also have what we have to bring up when we talk about maybe unreliability is Book of the New Sun by Gene Wolfe. Great example. One of the most fun examples, I think, of unreliability, perhaps, but a Severian. But yeah, that's probably enough on first person. So that's the
Okay.
I, we pronoun. Now we're going to talk about one of the, it's much more rare to see this than first person or third person, but second comes after first. So we're going to talk about it in order. And a second person narrator would be one that uses the clue is you, uses the pronoun you, the second person, all the time. This is fairly rare, and a lot of readers probably find it jarring. The most famous example I can think of is N.K. Jemison's the fifth season is the first book, but it's the Broken Earth trilogy, where I think it's used very cleverly, actually, and it becomes an important element of the story without giving away any spoilers here or anything. The choice it was bold, but I think it also had some major payoff, especially if you get to the end of that trilogy and you begin to understand why Jemison, at least in part, it's not entirely second person. There are by the way, the narrative can change in the course of the book. You can have a first person narrator and then switch to a second person or a third person. Dickens did it too. I mean, this is something that goes way
Well,
back in Bleak House, right? So
Dickens Dickens is one of those ones that you go, yeah, but he was writing as a serial publication most of the time, and then would go,
yeah,
people weren't responding to this. I'll do it completely differently. Like
right,
it's almost like a different production of narrative. But yeah, it can change, or it can be that there is an overarching narrator for the whole thing, but different parts of it are narrated within that. They are embedded narrators within that.
right.
We can get into that discussion in a minute as well, because
That's fun
again, that
stuff. Yeah,
that comp it complicates it, but this is part of the joy. It's not
yeah,
when quite often we fall into that trap of being overly simplistic and reductive, where we go, it is this thing and this thing means that,
yeah,
instead of using it as these are tags that we put on things that are shorthand, a way of describing, and then thinking about what is usually far more important: how, why, and what it is doing.
right.
Not necessarily just what the thing is. Identifying it is step one of about 99 other steps.
Yeah.
And that's part of what we're talking about here. So to talk about second person, you.
Which, yeah, Jemison's a famous example. I guess lit RPG would be something where you would more commonly find second person. Yeah.
And one of the major key examples were the choose your own adventure books.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
And what's interesting is the distinction we can make between the use of the second person narration in choose your own adventure versus how Jemison uses it. Because
Hmm.
they're actually used in almost radically different ways.
Agreed.
So, for those not familiar with the choose your own adventure books, you opened it up and it was like, and you have been drawn into this magical world and you're going to be sent on a quest. And as you go through, like you read the section and it'll say, do you choose to do X? Turn to page 57. Do you choose to do Y? Turn to section 102. If you have this item with you, turn to this page or this section, and you would flick through, and you were making decisions as you went through. Um, it's a very interesting example of kernels and satellites, which we'll talk about another time.
Hmm.
But with Choose Your Own Adventure, you, the reader, are the character.
Right.
So it's using second person where you, the reader, sitting in your room looking at it, you are that character. The way that Jemison uses it is you, the reader, are seeing through the perspective of a character within the story. So
Correct.
it's actually mimicking first person,
Mm.
but another character is talking to the first person narrator that you're sitting in.
Right.
You're sitting inside that character and they are being spoken to. So there's actually a separation. You, the reader, are not that character.
Right.
That is a character within the narrative who is being spoken to. And that's a perspective. So it's actually mimicking first person, but not using first person as the form of narration, using first person as the form of the narrative,
Hmm.
which some people might go, yeah, well, well, it's still second person. Yeah, it is still second person, but they are being used in very, very different ways.
Right.
One is you are the character. These are your decisions. The other is we are behind the eyes of a character. So
Mm.
again, what happens, what we talked about in first person of that intimacy and that immediacy of the events and feeling that we are part of it, that is being explored, but not that we physically are the character, which is what Choose Your Own Adventure was doing and what some interactive narratives did.
I have to wonder too if video games have encouraged the use of second person narration in things like lit RPG or choose your own adventure type things. I think that perhaps more people who are accustomed to that type of storytelling that happens in video games might more easily fall into second person narration. But yeah, a lot of us, I personally often have to take some time to adjust to a second person narration. For whatever reason, I have a harder time feeling absorbed in that, and it takes me a minute. But it works eventually, and it has its advantages, like all these others, and disadvantages.
But where I just said that Jemison's use was kind of like first person, it's
Right.
also kind of like
Yeah.
third person focalized, where if you're experiencing the camera on the shoulder of a character and getting access to their internal thoughts,
Right.
if that is the type POV that someone has chosen, that's very, very similar actually in effect to what Jemison was doing
Yeah.
because you're behind the eyes of a character. So it's while these are distinct, there is bleed over between all of these things. It's about the effect that is being created. And it's not that first person only does this, second person only does that. It's understanding it's used in different ways because authors are tricksy.
Yep. Well, that's a good segue into third person or non-participant is another way you can put that. Third person narrator. The clue again is he, she, they is the pronoun you're more likely to see. And the fact is you can have different levels of omniscience within third person that make it kind of fun and interesting. So you can have a completely omniscient narrator
You can
where
have different levels of omniscience within the others as well.
true, true. But in terms of third person, when we talk about an omniscient narrator, usually we're talking about a third person, I think, right? that can see into any character's. Okay, we'll talk about that. They can see, but basically, the omniscient narrator is one that can see into any character's head at any given moment, knows what's going on everywhere in the story. Omniscient, omniscience, right? All knowing. And you can also say all knowing if you prefer to use some good old Anglo-Saxon instead of the Latin. But yeah, this narrator sees into everybody's heads, can also do what's referred to sometimes as head hopping in the midst of a paragraph or a scene. You can be from one character, one POV, and switch to another. And that's what an omniscient narrator can do. Probably used to be a little more common than it is these days. These days, more often you find limited omniscient narrators, meaning the narrator is capable of knowing what's going on anywhere, but sticks to one POV. So think of how George R. Martin in A Song of Ice and Fire has chapters that are literally telling you at the beginning of the chapter, here's this POV, Arya or Tyrion or whatever. That's the chapter. And then you know who the POV is, and that's keeping to one character's perspective for the duration of that moment. And you can have that for an entire chapter. Other books may have a little like a space where suddenly we're shifting to a different POV, that sort of thing. But that's a fair, I think that's maybe the most common type of storytelling is limited omniscient these days, I would guess. But that's
it
up for debate, I guess. But
well, it's up for debate because depending on the genre and depending on which books you're looking at,
yeah,
there are a lot of YA and teen and even some children's stuff
right.
written in first person. Really, really common to write in first person and common to write in present tense.
Right.
Uh,
Present tense I've noticed there in the more YA stuff. Yeah. But
uh,
we'll get to past and present in a bit too.
but so, first of all, omniscience is separate to this first, second, or third because you can have and you do have first person omniscient storytelling.
Who know what's going on everywhere. Yeah.
And as soon as we finish talking about third person, we'll discuss omniscience. Let's talk about third person first.
Right. Let's finish with third person,
So,
Kishibe. And then the other one I wanted to mention was objective, an objective narrator, where
um,
that narrator
so,
doesn't see into anyone's head.
so if we have first person, we're behind their eyes.
Right.
If we have second person, um, it's basically the story is happening to us. We're behind our own eyes, or as Jemison did it, we're behind a character's eyes. So
Right.
you can see the similarity to first. With third person, depending on where that camera is placed, it can be in a character's head, but more typically is sitting on the character's shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
And third person is that slight distancing. So we as narratee, we as reader, we as viewer,
Right.
we have taken a step back. It's as if we are an invisible presence watching what is unfolding.
Right.
But what we can see, if it is very tightly limited to a character point of view, is limited to that particular character.
That's
But
limited.
the narrator may, still keeping limited for the next scene or next chapter, switch to a different character. And we are magically transported to then follow that character. And that is a level of omniscience.
Right.
Because how does the narrator know which character to follow? And that is a level of omniscience. But anyway, with third person, it's as if we are watching the events unfolding. We are not participating in them, and we are not directly behind the eyes of someone participating in them.
Fly on the wall. Yeah.
Is generally it.
Right.
And as you had mentioned about objective and limited and all of these different terms,
Right.
there is a range of expression of this to do with the limitation imposed on the amount of information available. Is it limited strictly to the point of view characters' external senses?
Right.
Is it the external senses plus their internal thoughts and feelings? Is it definitely it's what they can see, what they feel, and then what other people can see and feel, which is where, again, levels of omniscience. What does the narrator know? What is the narrator limiting the information to?
Right. And when
And
we
so,
talk about those, you mentioned in terms of the objective one, the narrator doesn't know anything other than what's actually just happening
yeah,
on a physical level. So the distinction there is like he felt very nervous as he approached the door. That's obviously knowing what's going on inside the character's head. That's not objective. That's at the very least a limited omniscient perspective. Whereas if you were to say his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob, that's objective, but it
yeah.
also is it's up to the reader then. So no hand holding, as they say, right? It's up to the reader with an objective narrator to figure, oh, he must be nervous because his hand is trembling, or as his sweaty palm reached for the door, okay, he must be nervous because his hand is trembling and his palm is sweaty. So the reader's a little bit more actively involved in the case of an objective narrator there.
And again, it's not it is this thing or that thing. Quite
Right,
often, if we think about it as poles on a spectrum, and
right,
it slides along, that there may be some level of evaluation and discourse about feelings. And so nervously, it's not fully objective, but it's not into the level of omniscience of he was nervous because he knew that there was a dragon on the other side of the door that was going to try and eat him.
right.
That would be fully omniscient, but and he didn't need to be, because a fully omniscient narrator not only knows what
Right.
is what is happening and everything that is happening, but also what will happen, because they already know the entirety of the story.
Right. And that was the
um
last time he ever saw her, or that kind of thing.
it's and it's while he thought it was an innocent decision at the time, he was going to come to regret this 12 hours later. Well, how does the narrator know that? Because the narrator already knows how the story ends. That's a level of omniscience.
Right.
So it's very easy, again, to fall into this bit. This is objective, as if it is only one thing. And you go, levels of objectivity, levels of subjectivity, levels of omniscience. It is a sliding scale, and it doesn't have to be perfectly balanced at a single point all the way through. Some elements can move a wee bit closer one way, and then the
Mhm.
author can take that step back and move the narrative perspective in a different direction, all to generate effect. And again, part of this is about communication. Is it important that the reader definitely know that the person is nervous? Or is the author wanting that narrative space, that psychic space, where a reader can place their consciousness and their interpretation? They're deliberately building in ambiguity for readers to play in, for readers to imagine and engage with what is happening on the page and create their own narrative and meaning, to create their own story from it, because that is a way of increasing engagement,
Yeah.
allowing us to be more active participants in decoding the information.
Yep. So speaking of increased engagement, one thing that you a term that would be useful for people to know, I think, and this is something you see most often, I think, with a limited omniscient narrator, is something called internal focalization, where you have this Joe Abercrombie is my favorite example. First Law books are they're a third person, limited omniscient. But what you'll often find is that the narrative voice bleeds into the character's personality. That you get this sense that, like when Abercrombie is writing from the perspective of one of the Northmen, right? The narrator is different from when, let's say, it's Jezal or something like that, somebody, a noble from a different place. Or when it's RD, you have it's like the narrative voice, in other words, imitates the character on some level. And you can refer to that as focalization, as internal focalization specifically. So that's a kind of a cool thing. And everybody sort of recognizes that, but to have that terminology to say, yeah, that's internal focalization, that's kind of useful.
And this was it's a refinement of a much broader concept of
Mhm.
free and direct discourse, free and direct speech, free and direct. There are multiple terms, but that's a very broad general term that actually is encompassing a whole lot of or slightly different but related elements. And so Jared Jeanette came up with the concept of focalization to deal very specifically with this one thing. And then breaking it down into like zero focalization and internal focalization and external focalization. But there are different levels of it. And again, it's thinking about it in terms of there's a spectrum. These are places on that spectrum, but there's free movement between them. And what we're talking about here is to take Abercrombie. Let's say Glotka and Logan are both standing in a room and they're looking at a staircase. How Glotka views and feels about that staircase
Good
is
example.
going to be different to how Logan views and feels about that staircase. So, from an objective perspective, with no character focalization at all, it would be there was a staircase. It was made of granite. It was rough hewn. You would get all of those external features.
Right.
If there was focalization through Glotka, it might be there was a miserable steep staircase of, because how he feels about it is actually going to affect how he sees it, how he perceives it, how he thinks about it.
Right.
Logan might look at it and go, oh God, stairs? Like, I just want to go to, would have a very, or he might even just go, it was stairs. Right. No focus or import attached to it because he doesn't care.
Right.
Glotka cares because he's going to have to walk up them.
Right.
And so even if they both walked into the room, Glotka might notice the stairs straight away if the chapter is from his perspective. Logan might notice the fact that there's a whole lot of swords on the wall. Right. Because he needed to get, or a whole lot of knives because you can never have enough knives.
Right.
That might be the thing that immediately draws his eye. So even the order of information in the narration can be affected by which character is perceiving it, depending on the level and amount of focalization that is being applied to that character. So you can see, even with third person, if the camera is just attached to that character and what they perceive, you can still have, well, what's the first thing that character is going to look at? Because that's an element of their psychology. We don't all immediately look at the same thing when we enter a room.
Right.
And so if that affects the order of information, that is a level of focalization. It's using the character as a way to limit and organize the information relayed to the narrative.
It's also using the narration to help the reader to gain a greater appreciation or understanding of the character. So it's really fantastic. Great strategy, and if you can articulate that, Abercrombie uses internal focalization in his third person narration in order to give us a better connection to the characters, in order to make them more vivid. Then you understand how he does that, really, and that's kind of cool, right? So go ahead.
Well, I was about to say, so if you can imagine, let's say we have a crowd of people, we all walk into a room, and on one wall, there's a bookcase with a whole load of fantasy novels and all this sort of stuff.
Sounds
on
good.
Another wall, there's a giant TV screen.
Okay.
On a different wall, there's a whole load of artwork. As we walk in, if our eye is immediately drawn to the books, that tells us something about us, the person perceiving it. Oh, in this room that has these different things, the first thing they noticed, the first thing they focused on, concentrated on, were the books. So that tells you something about the character. If the first thing they focused on was the TV screen, it might tell you something about the character.
Yeah.
And that's where sometimes we can misunderstand things, and we'll deal with it more with characterization, but implied characterization versus sort of direct or overt characterization.
That's our next video. Yeah. Cool.
But that's a great example of it, of even though it might be an entirely objective, limited to external stimuli, no level of omniscience, but if the character focuses on something, that can be revelatory about that character. And it goes to how we talk about that, is that sort of level of focalization.
Yep. And again, so many advantages to what, you have different pros if you're doing an objective narrator you're essentially allowing the reader to become more active, and to put two and two together. And that's an authorial choice that can have real repercussions. And some people might enjoy that particular choice more.
As
Um,
opposed to Guinevere, who was an arthurial choice.
Bam. Nice. I like it. That's your quota for terrible puns, mister. Uh,
For this half hour.
so, all right. So we have to talk about unreliability and past versus present. Which would you like to do first?
Well, let's do past and present because that's,
Okay.
you know what? We're not going to be talking about future. Um,
We might be in the future.
it gets complicated and there are reasons to do it, but for the most part, past and present are the two major forms, and they're quite easy to talk
Yeah.
about. So do you want to start with past tense, saying is you're the medievalist and that's where you live?
That's pretty much where I am all the time. Yeah. So yeah, advantages and disadvantages, and with the past tense, I think is probably perceived by most people to be the more standard, but they're really it's fine to use either. You mentioned earlier how present is something that is more commonly found these days in YA books, and I think that it does give present gives a little more immediacy, perhaps, to the narration. Whereas the past is the sort of standard feeling of, okay, you're being told a story now, right? And you're being invited to immerse yourself in this story when you are getting a past tense narration, that these events have happened and that you're being told about them. And so it's less immediate. And for me, I'm far more accustomed to pass, and it's easier for me to read that. It usually is a bit of an adjustment, frankly. I guess because maybe I'm dating myself here, but for me, it is certainly much more of an adjustment to read a present tense narration. But what do you want to say about past versus present?
Well, weirdly enough, this has to do with perception of norms. As
Mhm.
just as a starting point, if you or I are ever informally telling a story to someone, narrating something that happened in our, this is what happened. We naturally fall into past tense.
Right.
Anyway, oh, what happened to so and so last night? We don't shift into she is walking across the room,
I
and
don't. Yeah.
that is it's entirely artificial. We naturally fall into
Right.
telling things in past tense. That it is the natural form of storytelling, and it because of communication. It just is the sort of the base norm. But it implies that basically it's everything that has just happened
Right.
all the way through, that you're always living in the moment behind the action because this happened. And so because it's in past tense, we are getting that information a split second after it is actually happening because
Hmm.
it's in past tense. But that's why it is so common. That's why it is, in a lot of respects, the default for storytelling. We find it everywhere, from our personal lives to classical literature throughout time. It is the default. That does not mean it is the best, and it does not mean that there aren't exceptions. But narrating something in present tense is much more artificial.
Yeah.
There's no way around it. It is deliberately writing something in a format that is not natural.
Right.
And artifice is part of art.
Hmm.
Let's get all etymological here. But um, and one of the big things about putting something in the present tense is that immediacy.
Right.
These things are happening right in front of your eyes as they are occurring. And that's why quite often we have it linked to first person.
Right.
It's describing the events as they are occurring. There is a massive amount of immediacy to that. And that can drive engagement. It can feel more active, whereas past tense has that potential to feel uh, reactive or to feel passive.
Right.
That's the big thing. Past tense, particularly when it is used poorly, can feel extraordinarily passive,
Mm-hmm.
whereas present tense can feel incredibly active. So,
Yeah.
again, if you think about how the author is using it, it's not about which is more common and which has the greater history. It's
Right.
about those general sort of concepts. But of course, an author who knows what they are doing can use different techniques to make past tense seem more active,
Mm-hmm.
could use different techniques to make present tense seem more passive.
Right.
It all depends on how it's being deployed, but they naturally lean into those sort of two poles. And again, how it is being used, why it is being used that way, and the ability of the author to manipulate it, knowing that those are the effects, knowing that that's how we perceive it. That's the big takeaway from this,
Right.
I think.
Yeah. No, I agree completely. So that leaves us with unreliability. And this is a fun one, I think, because you can have an unreliable third person narrator, I'm sure. But probably most often you'll find it with the first person, where you have someone narrating the story, particularly if that person is the protagonist of the story. And one of my favorite examples is Red Queen's War trilogy by Mark Lawrence, where you have Jalin being the narrator, who makes certain assertions about himself. And then I think a careful reader will notice that certain actions that occur later on may contradict those early assertions about this character and his personality, and that's for a reason. And that these revelations help us understand, in this case, the psychology of this character. They help us to may even make the character more endeared to us. There are times like when an author gives us an unreliable narrator, like Huck Finn, for example, who is naive. So this is a narrator who's not unreliable because he's trying to deceive us. He's unreliable because he doesn't know better, and he will report things that we, the reader, understand a level of what's really going on here, just on the basis of his very naive reporting of what's happening. And he doesn't quite get everything that's happening, but we, the reader, get it. We understand what's really going on here, whereas he doesn't. He's just very naively reporting. And then sometimes you do have a narrator who's deliberately deceiving the reader in a way, and hopefully in a way that's clever and has some import later on, not just for the heck of it, right? So unreliability is something there's a range of reasons why and a range of effects that it can have.
Yeah. And that's why when we use the term unreliable, we use it as a catch-all term
Right.
for the dependability of the information presented in the narrative. But when we think about it in that way, how trustworthy is the narrative? It can fall into two major camps. And again, there are other aspects. But one is the information being relayed honestly? So trustworthiness of the narrator goes to their reliability. So, for instance, Harry Dresden in the Dresden books, is Harry Dresden going to lie about the information that is narrated to the reader, the narratee? You're like, no, Harry is trustworthy, but he doesn't have all of the information. His information is subjective.
Right.
Therefore, he can draw the wrong conclusion. Therefore, everything that Harry sees is going to be subjective, which means it's not fully reliable
A good
because it is.
example too, because Harry's perception of himself is sometimes at odds with the way other characters perceive him. So it's a good example. So he's not deliberately lying about himself, but he has a certain way of viewing himself that is not necessarily the same as the way other people view him. And when he gets a glimpse of how other people view him, it can be jarring for him, the character, but for us, the reader, we're saying, yes, Harry, this is how you should be. You should understand that, this is a perspective that you need to. It's a validating perspective for him, right?
And so when we talk about unreliability, Harry, in a lot of respects, is an unreliable narrator.
Right.
But that doesn't mean we go, oh, well, then we can dismiss everything that he says and does because he could just be lying. You know, he's honest, he's
Right.
trustworthy,
Right.
but his unreliability is linked to his subjectivity, his limited knowledge, and the perceptions, biases, all of those aspects that we talked about in terms of focalization. When you take someone like Hubert or Humbert, the narrator of Lolita,
Right.
is it
Humbert is in there somewhere.
Humbert?
Maybe. Yeah.
But he is actively lying
Right.
because he doesn't want to admit that what he thinks is evil and wrong. He actively lies. And Nabokov is very careful to put in moments to show that the narrator cannot be trusted because the narrator is bending and twisting the truth of what happened into something that is palatable to his version of events.
Right.
The narrator is lying to us. And it's the same with Severian. When we talk about, is Severian from Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun, is Severian lying to us, lying to himself, mistaken because of limited amount of information? So while we talk about unreliable narrators, we tend to use it as this catch-all term, as a general term for there is a level of ambiguity, but that ambiguity can be created in different ways. And the two most common ways are levels of trustworthiness and the amount of information accessible by the narrator. Those are the two major things. And understanding that distinction between the two helps us refine the type of unreliability that is being played with. Because let's say that we have a sequence and it's they burst through the door. It's if the narrator has limited subjective knowledge, then we have no reason to doubt that particular fact.
Right.
We can trust that because they are trustworthy and this is something within their range of experience. If the narrator is lying and we know that the narrator lies, they burst through the door. Would the narrator lie about that? How would it benefit the narrator or make them look good or serve their point of view to say that these characters burst through? Would it? And that's the difference between these two things. It's not hand wave. Oh, it's all just unreliable. That's what a 5-year-old does. Right. It's understanding that the different techniques highlight different information within the text in which ambiguity can be present. It's not hand wavy, oh, because it's unreliable, therefore everything is unreliable.
Right.
You have to understand that the type of unreliability filters and shapes the type of information that can be ambiguous. And even then, if a character is telling a story, if the narrator is an identified narrator and is narrating the story from a particular perspective, that their reason for doing so may alter and shape how they narrate things, that it is not then a literal, objective version of events. It is falling into a narrativized artificial form that serves the purposes of the narrator.
Yeah, I don't know if it's possible to talk about this one without spoiling things, but a fascinating example for those who've read it is Toll the Hounds by Stephen Erickson. There's all kinds of interesting narratological stuff going on in that one, which I don't think we can talk about without spoiling something, but...
Okay, well, what about Catcher in the Rye?
Aha, okay, yeah.
So Holden Caulfield, why does Holden is telling this story?
Right.
Why is Holden telling the story? Why does Holden refer to people in certain ways, describe people in certain ways? How does it serve Holden's purpose? And the thing is, once you've read the whole story, once you've gotten to the end of the narrative,
right,
once you understand all of those things, then you apply that filter of, okay, how does knowing about that A, subjectivity, but also B, unreliability in terms of trustworthiness, how does that affect how we perceive the events?
Right.
And does that change? It doesn't always, but does it change our understanding of what actually happened?
Yeah.
And that ambiguity, that space that is left is for the reader to inhabit within the bounds of what the fiction has created. So this is where we talk about meaning is created by the reader, but for it to be a valid reading, it has to be within the bounds of the information presented within the text.
Right.
Texts are not infinitely flexible, but they are vast, and the subtle meanings and the subtle interpretations are as numerous as the number of readers. But that does not mean that all readings are equally valid, and some readings can be partially valid and partially invalid. It all depends on the how that interpretation is built and whether or not we are aware of the information in the text that is counteracting it or contradicting it, if we've taken that into account, all sorts of different elements. But that space allows for a type of immersive reading where we are generating meaning and understanding and the entirety of this narrative. We generate it in our minds.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good stuff. And it really does help you to appreciate the stories that we read when you can think about them on these levels.
So very quickly then, omniscience.
Right. Back to omniscience. Yes.
The reason omniscience is difficult is because, again, we use it's an omniscient narrator as if it's just that one thing. Omniscience, again, is there are multiple aspects to it. Is the narrator aware of all of the events that transpired from any point in the story? Because that is a level of omniscience. So, like the example that you gave earlier, he made that decision. Little did he know he was going to come to regret that in less than 20 minutes.
Right.
That is a level of omniscience because the narrator knows something that hasn't happened yet, but they already know that it is going to happen. They know what happened. That is a level of omniscience.
Right.
Another level of omniscience would be knowing what is happening in all the different characters' heads. There's a different level of omniscience that is not related to narrative progress, but it can be limited to just what is happening in that scene. So the narrator may not know what is going to happen later on, but in any given scene, the narrator can know everything that is happening in everyone's head.
Dune, for example, during well, I can't say the specific scene, but in Dune in general, there are moments where the omniscient narrator, there's a bunch of people in a room, and the omniscient narrator can shift and present things from one character's perspective in one paragraph, even a sentence, and the next one, boom, we're in another character's perspective in that scene. And it works well, and you know which scene I'm actually thinking about, probably. Yeah.
It's one of my favorite scenes from Jin. But what's weird about that is, like, people sometimes derogatorily refer to that as head hopping, and that is bad. You shouldn't do that. But they're absolutely fine with, well, that scene is from that point of view, and in that person's head. This new scene is from a different person's point of view, and in their head. And then this chapter is from a different part. You go, that's exactly the same thing. It's the same level of omniscience. What they're talking about is the expression of it and how difficult it can be for a lot of modern readers in following the shift of point of view within a paragraph.
Right.
But the actual shifting of point of view is fine. No one has a problem with that because a Game of Thrones and George R. R. Martin's whole A Song of Ice and Fire.
Right.
Different chapters from different points of view, where we get insight into it. Therefore, the narrator of the entirety of A Song of Ice and Fire has access to all the different characters' points of view and their knowledge. It's an omniscient, a certain level of omniscience narrator, because they pick and choose which character we're going to follow.
Right.
And can look into all of these different characters' heads.
But sticks more consistently with one character for a chapter, which is literally legal for us.
And that's the thing. If we can follow, and again, part of it is about our own skill in following the cues to recognize when things shift. And having a chapter, Arya's start, you're like, I don't need to have a huge amount of skill to figure out whose point of view is going to be in this. Jon Snow. Oh, I wonder which point of view this is going to be.
Right.
Like, if you remove those very quickly within that chapter, we would still realize.
Yeah.
Because you don't need that. But there's a nice handy clue for you. So again, it's about the level of skill. And again, let me reiterate very, very clearly here. Skill is developed through practice. It is not intelligence. And
Right.
people keep talking about this as, oh, well, you have to be really smart.
Nope.
You This is not about intelligence. It's about familiarity and practice of skills.
Right. Right.
And so authors making things more overt is not about them thinking people are stupid.
Right.
It's making things more overt for people who are less practiced.
Right.
Radically different things. Someone doesn't know how to do the front crawl. Well, you're stupid. Clearly not. It's a skill. It's not intelligence. It's a skill.
And there are so many different realms where you can develop skills, and realms where you haven't yet. So I can look really smart when I'm talking about, medieval literature, but I probably would sound like a moron if I'm talking about how to, fix a car engine or something, So yeah.
But to get back to omniscience,
Yes.
sorry for that diversion.
Digression. Yes.
Um, with omniscience, omniscience has to do with levels of knowledge. As you pointed out, omniscience. It has to do with the levels of knowledge, and that's why limited omniscience, subjective omniscience, we can apply all of these things because knowledge. It's not all knowledge, no knowledge. You know,
Mm.
that again would be a rudimentary someone who has taken one course and through, oh well, I heard about this term and that's what that term means. Yeah.
Right.
But if you actually just think about it just for a second, it's about levels of knowledge, and levels of knowledge are not fixed. We have extremes: no knowledge, all knowledge, and then everything in between. And how an author plays with that, that's why we can talk about limited omniscience and subjective omniscience, because you can have an omniscient first person.
Yes, you
It's
can.
rare. It is rare,
Pretty rare. Yeah.
but you can do it.
Yeah.
Why would you want to do it? Because it kind of does it go against what you're trying to do? But if you think about it in terms of knowledge, if it's a first person narrator who is a homodiegetic narrator, they're going to narrate something about their own life, and
Right.
they are much later on in life. They are, for all intents and purposes, a certain level of omniscient for that narrative, because at any given moment in their narration, they can tell you how the narrative ends.
Or maybe an autobiography would be an example. Yeah.
Autobiography is or biography even, but that would be heterodiegetic because they're outside, the narrator would be outside of it. But you can see how this works. And again, it can be so tempting to take that very reductive, simplistic approach because it's easy, just stick a label on it. These labels and shorthands are there to describe what is happening. They are there to help us understand what is happening. They are not prescriptive about what should happen.
Right.
And that's why a lot of this stuff is really, really useful, because instead of having this preconceived, well, this was meant to be omniscient, but why did that happen? Instead of doing that, we actually pay more attention to what is happening, and it helps us refine our understanding.
And that's the beauty of it right there. So, well, this has been another great, at least I think, great discussion on very important elements of storytelling, which is narrative perspective, and having a more nuanced understanding of these kinds of decisions that authors make about what kind of narrator they're going to have and the various effects that they can achieve after making that initial decision. Okay, I'm going to have an objective narrator. So what are the strengths of that? You're inviting the reader to participate and put things together. Having a limited omniscient narrator, on the other hand, maybe allows you to really bring that character's personality, that the POV character's personality to the fore. An omniscient narrator allows you to offer a variety of perspectives on one event simultaneously, which can have a really wonderful effect during a story as well. So there's just all kinds of options out there. And whether you're doing the first, second, or third person, it will have an effect on the way the reader experiences the story. So good discussion. Next time, we are going to be talking about characters over at A Critical Dragon. So please be sure to catch that discussion.
And just remember, just because you are a character doesn't mean that you have character.
Hey, you were already, you exceeded your quota, mister. So, all right, thank
Thank
you.
you for having me along for this discussion, Philip.
Oh, it's been a blast. But we will see everybody in the next one over at A Critical Dragon. Until next time.